And we'll see. I'm hoping I've been going through all the Rome stuff kind of faster than I had anticipated. So if we end early, we end early because I'm planning on still doing more Rome next week, just on Monday to finish off the Empire because the Empire is what most people think about when they think of Rome. Right. But I did want to touch base with you on the article about the statues because some of you already knew that information, but the article makes the case for why paying attention to this information and making it more widely known that the ancient statues were colorful when they were first created, why that should be more prominently and why more people should know it, right? So who caught her argument? Why does she say the color of the statues matter? Carlos? Yeah.
Yeah, so basically, their argument is talking about that one specific. Um, Hold on, let me pull it up. Apollo, what's his name? This is horrible. Apollo Belvedere, right? So basically saying that like everybody views that statue as like the pinnacle of perfection, and because it's white, they're just like, if this statue is white, therefore everybody should be white, and they base it off of that, and they have this like weird pseudosciences around that.
Yeah, it's not even about like the actual thing, it's the way humans make meaning out of the things, right? Because we can all logically like learn the information that ancient statues were painted, right? That when they were exhibited, when they were put up in places, they had color. The color has faded. So now if you go to a museum, you don't see color on the statues, they just look white, right? But because we admire Rome so much and the history of Rome, right, and we've preserved so much of those Roman statues, we create standards of beauty around them, right? And so, like this, like porcelain white look becomes beautiful, right? It gets defined as beautiful, and why does that matter? But because we could argue, well, what's wrong with considering that beautiful? What are the negative consequences of creating standards of beauty based on what these Roman statues look like now? It becomes standard. It's the ideal to look forward to. And then what happens to anything that's colorful, bright, shiny? Is that still beautiful? Do I have to? The answer. You're not saying, yeah. so, so Gerardo, for you, colorful is beautiful. But when you create these standards of beauty, the idea is that okay, the thing we should all aspire to is this clean whiteness, the aesthetic of this clean whiteness that we see in these Roman statues, and then things that are more colorful, more bright, end up becoming or considered not as beautiful. Not for everybody, but the standard is that's beautiful, and colorful, interesting things are not considered beautiful. Did somebody want to add something? Did I see? Sometimes I don't catch who's turning on their mic right away, but that has a very real effect because for example, in a lot of Latin America, color is used very prominently, and colorful is considered beautiful, and that's the standard. But then when it's measured up again in an international stage or in a Western perspective, when you put things side by side, generally people will consider, the ancient statues that are now look white more beautiful than colorful art from places like Latin America. Right? That's considered not as beautiful. It ends up not getting the same kind of attention because the standard has been set that the clean white is better. So, a lot of this is place specific, and it's really more of a critique of Western white standards of beauty, right, that are created around this false idea of Roman statues. Right? It also feeds just forgetting that these statues had color in them, also feeds into a lot of racist ideas of what Rome was like. Right? If you look at some of the paintings and sketches and things like that, you see a much more diverse version of Rome depicted. But if all you see about Rome is the white statues, it kind of reinforces people that already want to look at Rome as a white state, right? As a white organization, as a white entity. It having the white statues kind of reinforces that idea. And so what does she say? What does Sarah Bond say? How do we fix this problem? If this is a problem, and you can disagree with her that it's a problem, but if it's a problem, how do we fix it? No, maybe we don't fix it. We just let it be. I'll pull up the article so I can at least give you a chance to answer it. Oh, someone's answering it in the chat. Let's see. Oh, why isn't it letting? Sometimes it doesn't let me see the chat unless I go to share more information. Yeah, Sarah Bond is especially concerned with the way the white statues are displayed in museums. Right? She doesn't think we shouldn't paint them, right? Because we don't want to damage a statue, right? We want to preserve whatever it is. And so the color has faded. So we're not going to paint the statue. But one of the things she does advocate is for better displaying that information, especially in museums, right? That when you walk in a museum and look at the description, sometimes that's all we do, right? Is all we quickly look at the statue, maybe look at the description, and that the descriptions should say what the original statue would have looked like, right? Some museums apparently have started doing that more, and they might even have a visual representation in the description of what the color would have looked like originally. Right? And that she's saying that things like that can really help reinforce what we already know, that these statues were colorful. Right? What did you all think of that? Even if you didn't read the article, that I'm telling you that is one of the things she argues in there, that the museums can do a better job of showing an audience, showing museum goers like the original color that would have been present in the statues. So what do you think of that?
I totally agree. Yeah, because it's like, you go to ruins and you see half of it, and they tell you, oh, this once housed this, and that, and it gives you all this bunch of crazy backstory. But like for statues, they're just like, oh, this is an Apollo bust. Good job.
Yeah. It's and I was saying it's pretty interesting, right? And especially when you can see the comparison. Some museums, it's still quite rare, but some museums are really good at displaying the images side by side, right? A visual representation of what they would have looked like in the ancient world. So something like this, for example, would be the way the color would have looked like at the time, right? The mixture of colors and patterns and all of that for a lot of these statues has just faded and they're just white now. But it can make a difference in the way you look at things to just add that visual representation next to it, reminding us that, hey, originally there was color. Right, here's an image of how just subtly it can make a difference to put color in like the faces of these statues, right? If you look at a pure, just white looking statue, it might reinforce that idea of Rome and whiteness. If you look at this, what you see is different, right? You see skin tone, you see color, and actually you're seeing somebody that has some ethnic features that are not Caucasian or might not be read as Caucasian. And it can, something like this can help reinforce the idea that, hey, the Roman Empire was actually quite diverse. Right. So this is a painted Roman Egyptian mummy mask of a man. Right. So it's a reminder that hey, Egypt, not exactly well, the ethnics of what racial group Egyptians belong to is it's very political right now today. But it's a reminder that not everybody who is part of the Roman Empire would be considered white today, right? Whereas, all right, I guess I should have put not suitable for work warning, but these are ancient statues, so we're not going to censor them. Where something like this, like, can really reinforce some of the racist ideas, right? Of like, whiteness and also beauty, right? Whiteness equals beauty. Yeah, right. Color adds a lot more. Like, it makes the statues more interesting, right? I agree. I'm like, I tend to value color a lot more. And maybe some of it is also because, like, I was born in Mexico. My parents are both Mexican, and I've been exposed to a lot of not a lot, but more Mexican art, which tends to be very colorful, right? So, for example, my mom has always liked having the house painted in colors. Like growing up, our house was this shade of blue. In my neighborhood, it stood out. It's like all the other neighborhoods with the same like beigey white color. And here was my Mexican mom painting her house blue. And even the inside, she picked a different shade of blue inside. And I know people told her that it was tacky, that the blue was tacky. And my mom didn't care about whatever people thought about her tackiness. But that's like kind of judgment that goes the way people are judged, right? Color can, some people judge it as tacky, right? Um, your tias did the same. And I look a lot at like YouTubers and social media influencers and stuff, especially like home decor influencers. I'm in my 30s, so I look at a lot of home decor these days. Um, but a lot of the more popular ones tend to be like the white couch, the white wall. They might have pops of color here and there, but it's typically clean white, maybe silver or gold accents, but usually clean white with the gold or the silver accents. hmm And I'm like, well, what? I'm like, what if I want a blue couch or an orange couch? Why does that color automatically feel tacky when I'm being influenced by all these images of houses like that? And some of it we can just trace to like these Western ideals that are actually based on misunderstandings of art, right? Misunderstanding Rome as being, having these white statues when in reality they would have had color. Get my you, I had a bright pink couch in graduate school, guys. It was given to me. I didn't actually choose the pink couch, to be fair, but when you're a student, you take whatever is given to you for free. And when we merged households with my boyfriend, he made me sell the couch. And relationships, you have to compromise. So we bought new couches instead. But it stuck with me of like, wait, why? What's wrong with a pink couch? Really? You're the has a pink unicorn theme couch? That's amazing. Tan or brown. And because it's like that gets associated with masculinity, we also gender a lot of this, right? Like the brown woodsy, like things get associated as like being masculine, and other things get associated as like feminine. I love you guys. I'm gonna when I get my bright couch, I'm gonna tell you all. I actually men pick boring colors.
Oh, I take offense to that.
Do you pick better colors?
Yeah, yeah. So I'm a designer. My girlfriend loves everything in black. So yeah, I would like to think that
Really? Okay.
I can match colors.
So what did you think overall, since as somebody with a design background then of the overall the Sarah Bond article?
Um, so it was really loaded for me. So I also was exposed to colors a lot, and I didn't really see that side of the article until much later. So I guess had to learn racism. So I was like,
Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, it makes sense, like for it to have a bunch of colors.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and by the way, I'm not telling you that if you like white walls and white couches that you're being racist. I'm not telling you that you are allowed to like your white aesthetic or your, just one color aesthetic. But I think one of the larger points that Bond doesn't even mention in her article, but I think one of the larger points for me is that a lot of times we don't realize the way our taste is shaped by other cultural elements, that we do get influenced, right? If all we see from like the time we're little kids to the time we're adults is a particular kind of color combination or color aesthetic, then that's what we associate as beautiful. And when we encounter other things, we're not going to like them as much, right? So it is constructed by our cultural experiences, the things we like and the things we don't like, right? And I think that's really hard to accept because we all like to think like, no, nobody's influencing my views. I'm making up my own mind, but we are like, there are subtle ways in which society has an influence in the things we like and don't like. Your mom has grown to love the rainbow view and compromise. Yes, and in relationships, this is what you learn early on in a healthy relationship. There's always compromise. So maybe you have a one brown, boring look a room, and then the bright room in a different place. Okay, then let's. I'm like I love talking about color, even though I'm a terrible, terrible artist. But I like art and I like design, but I'm not good at it. Okay, let's get back to the politics of Rome. So we left off with killing Julius Caesar. So Julius Caesar dies, and then there's a power struggle between Mark Antony and who is aligned with Cleopatra, and Julius Caesar's adopted son, right? And the details here I'm going to skip because they're not super important. But the key thing is about Julius Caesar's adopted son. His name was Octavian, and he's 18 years old when Julius Caesar dies, so he's still really young. One of the things he does to try to gain power in Rome is calls his father soldiers. Right, there was a lot of men who had a lot of loyalty towards Julius Caesar. And so Octavian calls them up to come serve under him. And the surprising thing is that they showed up. They didn't have to, right? Julius Caesar's men could have been like, no, our loyalty belonged to your father, not to you. But they come, right? And so he's able to, he basically inherits Julius Caesar's armies, right? And that, although Mark Antony and Cleopatra have a larger force because they've combined their military forces, this is going to give Octavian an edge because Julius Caesar's armies are well trained and seasoned. They have a lot of battle experience, right? So, um, the first thing he has to do, though, is get the Senate under control. So he does. They make him angry because they don't run things by him, right? The Senate under Julius Caesar could not do anything on their own. Everything had to be approved by Julius Caesar. And here the Senate is trying to regain their power under Octavian, and Octavian's not having it, right? So he strikes first against the Senate, kills multiple senators, and basically forces them to obey him. Then he has to turn his eyes to Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and they go to war. There's several battles, but ultimately, who wins?
Octavian.
Octavian wins. Octavian wins, and I should do what he does and change his name. Octavian becomes
Augustus.
Augustus. By the way, this Julius Caesar and Augustus is the reason we have July and August in our calendars. They changed the calendar and they add months named after themselves. But he becomes Augustus. And if you know your Roman history, you know Augustus because Augustus is the first Roman emperor. And so here we can draw, the end date of the Roman Republic might be a little bit iffy, but the beginning of the Roman Empire is clear. The Roman Empire begins with the reign of Augustus, because he will declare himself emperor, right? And he will have full authority. In Rome, there's still going to be some legislative bodies and such, but they have no authority. Everything is through Augustus. And so from this point on, from the beginning of Augustus's reign to the fall of Rome, we have the Roman Empire. In the Roman Empire, we have a lot of interesting social dynamics happen, right? So, one, social classes do change a little bit. Not a super ton, but they do change a little bit. So, under the Republic, at the top of the social hierarchy would have been the senatorial class. So, the families of any men who serve in the Senate belong to this upper class. You can't get higher than the senatorial class during the Republic. Right? These are the people that own the most property and have the most wealth. Below the senatorial class, you would have the equestrian class. Right? These are men and their families who they would be quite wealthy, not as wealthy as the senatorial class, but they would still own property and they're wealthy. And then the lower classes there's much more variety in the lower classes, but you would have the commons, or a lot of the plebs belong to this commons class that were free-born Roman citizens. So people not born into slavery, and have citizenship within Rome. You would also have the Latins, so it's these other Italian allies, other people in the Roman territory, that at first don't have citizenship but do gain citizenship over the course of the Republic. You would also have foreigners, all other freeborn men and women who live in Roman territory but do not have access to citizenship. They are not citizens. And then you would have freed people. So anybody who was a former enslaved person who had either gained or been granted their freedom. But they are kind of towards the bottom of the social hierarchy. Below them, of course, are the slaves. Right? Below them are enslaved people. And you really don't want to be a slave in the Roman Republic. It means that you have been captured in battle, and there is a chance that you are working in hard labor in a Roman farm. If you were luckier, you would get assigned to do more like housework, and that is where Roman slaves had a little bit more wiggle room. People could basically have a lot of freedoms as a slave. You weren't legally free, but you had a lot of freedom of movement. People that worked in the home could be accountants, they could be business advisors, they could have much more variety in their roles. Not legally free, but there was more flexibility among some of the enslaved people there. But again, if you're working in the fields, you really don't want to be a slave here. Right? And here's this one. The key thing here, though, is that it's not racially based. right? It's not based on slavery. Skin color did not matter in terms of your social class in Rome. They just didn't have the same idea about race. Modern ideas about race get created as Europeans encounter um, Native people in the Americas and more people in the African continent. That's when they develop these modern ideas about race and about whiteness being superior. Right? For in this world of the Romans and just globally at this time, that idea just doesn't exist. People understood and they saw the differences in skin tones, right? They saw some people are darker, some people are lighter, but they didn't add that moral element to it, right? You were superior if you won in battle, period. That was the determining factor for superiority. Right? But one of the key things where you see that like slavery would not have been desirable even here is there were a lot of laws about runaway slaves, and that could be really harsh. They would put metal collars on runaway slaves, telling everybody that this slave has already run away. And basically, if you see them out and about, you were supposed to grab them and take them back to their owner. Women in Rome. Do you want to be a woman in Rome? It depends. It depends. So a lot of like the senatorial class essentially disappears with the end of the Roman Republic. You still have this elites, but really at the top of the hierarchy, you had the emperor's family. If you're a woman in the emperor's family, you might have power and you might have quite a bit of freedom, right? Or if you belong to one of the upper classes, you also probably have quite a bit of freedom, right? Um, in in the case of the Latins and foreigners and slaves, children assumed the status of their mother, right? So if your mother was a free-born Roman citizen, then you had Roman citizenship. If your mother was a slave, then you would be born a slave. Right? Even if your mother was a slave and your father was free, you would you the relationship there was you earned the role your mother had. So uh, that was used to determine social class to a large extent and basically to maintain the system of slavery. Women were a large focus of the government. They liked to pass a lot of laws when it came to women, which tells us that, some women were pushing boundaries here. But Augustus, especially, was very concerned with the Roman family because birth rates seemed to be diminishing. They weren't keeping track the way we are. They weren't taking the same kind of census information, but visibly, culturally, it was known that a lot of people were just not getting married in the Roman Empire. Why is that a problem? If people aren't marrying and having kids, why would anyone think that's a problem?
Have less soldiers.
You have less soldiers. Also, eventually less workers too, but less farm hands, less people to support the economy, and so that is seen as a problem. This has been like occurring throughout history, um, and so Augustus tries to make changes. Right. The other problem that Augustus saw was not just people not getting married and not having kids, but also people getting married to the wrong people, marrying outside of their class. That he saw that as a problem. Marrying outside of your class was not good, according to Augustus and other leaders. Um, Also, a lot of people that did get married would be having extramarital affairs. And that was very common. So, like the sexual politics in Rome were actually not very strict culturally. Like affairs were not, didn't even have to destroy marriages. You had an affair, big deal. People didn't, it was not a big deal. So, what does he do? Well, if you remained unmarried past a certain age, you had to pay a fine. So
What
there's
the
always, yeah, Christian.
what the hell? Like that's so weird.
But nothing like a financial incentive, right? Hey, if you don't get married, you're gonna pay. But that was to encourage people to get married. The more children you had, the more financial benefits you gained. We still do that one, right? The more kids you have, the more tax breaks you get. It's the same idea. Um, Augustus also passed laws to try to stop adultery. So, for example, a husband who became aware of the adultery of his wife had to divorce her. He had to divorce her. Now, why in the world would there be a law forcing men to divorce their wives when the goal is to be married? What's and can anybody decipher the logic here?
Is it because you can't remarry? Like, if there's a girl out there that's has already been married, she's undesirable.
Ah, actually, no. That would kind of make sense. But the idea was that people that are having affairs were not having kids, right? Because you don't want to have kids outside of marriage, right? And so that was generally there was cultural stigma around having kids outside of your marriage. And so the idea was like, well, if you're gonna be having a sex with other people that are not your husband, and you're not having kids because the sex you're having is with somebody else, then get a divorce and then marry someone else. So if a husband caught the wife committing adultery, he had to divorce her. He was also going to be encouraged to remarry. You're not supposed to remain single, so you were supposed to remarry and have kids with a new spouse. But not only did you have to divorce the wife if you were a man, but you had to take her to court.
Ouch.
So she could be imprisoned and fined for the adulterous affair. If the husband caught the wife in the middle of sex with another man, he could kill the other man and not go to jail. No problem. What do you think of that? Sound good? I'm like, if you've ever been cheated on, it might start sounding kind of good. But the double standard here was a wife could not do the same thing. A wife cannot do the same thing. And that is something that stays in a lot, or something that ends up being adopted into Western laws later on. This idea of only the man can initiate a divorce, and for a woman to divorce a husband would be extremely difficult. There were legal ways of doing it, but really the laws were designed to make it very difficult for a wife to divorce her husband. Yeah, you basically had to catch him in the middle of having sex with witnesses. Now, let me ask you, how successful do you think Augustus was at changing the behavior of Romans when it comes to this stuff? Any guesses? Who thinks he was successful? Anyone? Give me a thumbs up. No one? Who thinks he was not successful?
I don't think he was successful.
The rest of you are undecided. He was not. And this is also something you see in history over and over again. Because you're trying to restrict what people feel are their private business. Who they marry, when they marry, how many kids they have. People tend to believe that that is their private business and not the business of the state. So he was actually not racist. These things didn't change very much. But he was very, these laws were very blunt and very meant to be disruptive. The other thing about Augustus was that he was less of a hypocrite than a lot of other political leaders. He enforced these laws even in his own family. He exiled his daughter and granddaughter for uh, for committing adultery. And you don't always see that, right? A lot of politicians that pass these kinds of strict laws are usually very hypocritical. A lot of times they're not doing the things that they're following. But he did not care who it was. He was especially harsh in his family because he felt that the emperor's family should be a model for all other families. And so he did end up exiling his own daughter, and then I believe his own granddaughter as well. So his children were under a lot of pressure to get married, and the wives who married into his family were held to a higher standard even than he would expect out of the public. All right, in terms of marriage, though, okay, so one thing that does make Rome a little bit more flexible, the Roman Empire here, is that if you were a woman, you could initiate a divorce here. Right? It was under Augustus, it was easier for a man, but generally under Roman law, women could initiate a divorce. And that's a big deal when that is possible in Rome. And for a majority of Roman history, that is possible. Initially, too, this was one of the problems Augustus ran up against, that under Roman law, marriage was a private act. He tried to make it public, right? He thought it was the business of the emperor whether or not you got married. But in Roman law from before him and then after him, it was seen as a private act. You didn't need to tell the state that you were married. Right? Nowadays, if you want your marriage to be legal, you have to fill out paperwork, a marriage certificate, and it all has to be approved by government. And that Romans were not in the business of that. Right? If the couple did get divorced, the husbands were encouraged to give back any dowry that had happened. Now, this whole thing with like marriage being private act, most people would never even have a wedding ceremony. They wouldn't have a wedding ceremony unless you were a member of an elite family. If you were higher in the social hierarchy, you probably wanted to throw a party. You'd have a ceremony and invite everybody and do that, but it was not required. And then and if you were not wealthy, you would not have one. And there was no real stigma about divorce and remarriage. Getting divorced and remarrying was fairly common.
With the point, like, children would stay with the father,
Mm-hmm.
like, so they would live with him, but does that mean that they didn't have access to see their mom ever, or did they just primarily stay?
It didn't necessarily mean that, but it meant that the father had legal rights over the children because they were the ones who were going to inherit his wealth, right? So the father had like all legal say after the divorce over where the children went to school, who they married. All of that had to be approved by the father, and if there was the mother didn't have to be consulted. But that was the law. In reality, how that actually played out, the children would not be prohibited from seeing their mother. They knew who their mother was, and she might remarry, and that was fine. So that's also another important thing, right? When we talk about some of these laws, is what the law says and then what people actually did. When it came to the children would stay living with the father. They could see the mother though. Right? And usually they would, because they would be in the same kind of social circles. Unless there was some sort of big issue there. Humans and drama. I've always really been interested with some of these topics of like abortion and infanticide in ancient history. In Rome, you have very interesting division of who does what when it comes to these things. Very clearly, there was some form of contraception being practiced, right? Because people were limiting the amount of kids they were having, right? The population was not growing significantly. The population of the Roman Empire grew as the empire extended, as you acquired more land and more people. But internally, within the city of Rome, people were having less kids. That means that they were practicing some form of birth control for sure, right? They don't have medical birth control. They don't have the pill or things like that. But there would often be kind of acid-like liquids that a woman would use to clean herself after sex to kill the sperm. Right? And that has been done for a really long time. I mean, people use some really weird things with the idea that it was meant to kill the sperm inside the vagina, and some things might have worked. Most likely, some of that is not working. But there were other things people did to prevent conception. Abortion was widely practiced as a form of birth control in Rome, right? Because you couldn't rely, not everything was very reliable to prevent conception, so you might practice abortion instead. But it was primarily practiced by people of the upper classes. One, you had to have the right, typically the way you would induce an abortion is by creating some sort of potion. There were plants that we know that the Romans had that were grown by people that would have been effective abortion inducers. We have in ancient medical texts, like people writing down versions of these abortion recipes. And we've been able to test some of these recipes, and we know that there were effective ingredients in some of the recipes. Now, it's funny the evidence we have. So we have, this gets written down by people, but in the recipes we have, a lot of times it's incomplete recipes or recipes that wouldn't give you the exact proportions. For example, there are some seeds and leaves of plants that will induce an abortion. But if you ingest too much of it, it will also kill you. And a lot of times in the recipes that get written down, they don't tell you exactly how much to put of each thing. And so it's working to some extent. What we think is happening is that a lot of these recipes and the herbs, plants, and seeds that are effective, knowledge of it gets passed down from person to person. It's just an oral tradition, right? Because presumably at first, it's all trial and error. If the abortion recipe hurts someone, then they're not going to use it again. But the minute they see it functioning, then that's the stuff that gets repeated over and over again. And it's probably being passed down orally. Right? But if you couldn't afford, right, in order to do one of these recipes, you either had to know the recipe, have access to the plant, or be able to pay someone to do it. Right? You don't have doctors in the same way. The practice of medicine is beginning to be developed. There are some people trying out techniques, creating instruments, doing that. But most commonly, people are going to, whatever the local knowledgeable person is. And they probably have a garden where they might be growing a plant that is effective in inducing an abortion. But you probably have to pay that person. Poor people don't have that money to be able to pay for these abortions. So instead, they would carry a pregnancy to term and then commit infanticide through exposure. That meant leaving a newborn out in the wilderness to die of cold or whatever, to die out in the open. So that was much more common again for the lower classes to practice infanticide. Abortion was not illegal. I should say it was not illegal. Infanticide was not illegal in Rome at first for a long time. It's actually not until Christianity becomes the dominant religion that changes. But abortion and infanticide were commonly practiced and were not illegal. Right? In addition, so the pater familias means the male head of household. So the man in a family had almost complete rights over his kids, right? Legally, even if the child was wanted by some other family member, if the father wanted to expose the child, he could. And that would be more common in cases of children being born out of wedlock or children born with a physical deformity that was visible, right? So the, some of the actual numbers of how much this was happening is hard to track because people aren't writing these things down, but we do know there's enough evidence to know that this was, one, not illegal and not super uncommon, especially with how hard it was once Christianity becomes the dominant religion. And in Rome, it's very hard for for Christian authorities to enforce these laws against infanticide. Because people were so used to practicing and it was so common that at first they're very difficult to enforce. Now, especially the infanticide part, I think sounds really terrible. Like you just leave the newborn out to die, right? I think it shocks a lot of our like modern morality. I was like, but why would you do that? And the thing is, like, for all the reasons you might think of, right? If the family was poor and you don't have another mouth to feed, right? Or the social stigma of having a child with a disability, or the stigma of a child being born out of wedlock. Right? On abortion, even though it was not illegal, right? It was legal. Abortion was legal in Rome. There were some divided opinions on it, right? Aristotle, for example, believed that abortion was okay, legitimately okay, before the fetus begins to move. So probably in like the first, they don't have the same idea of like trimesters, but before there's movement of the fetus, Aristotle believed that you could, that it was totally okay to to have an abortion and not okay afterwards. Right. But then there are other things that complicated there. The Hippocratic Oath did forbid people that were training to be doctors, who were doctors, from administering an abortifacient. In the huge medical treatise that is created during the Roman Empire, it says a doctor cannot administer any of these abortion-inducing potions. But then in the same medical text, it also tells doctors, it shows doctors which tools can be used to perform an abortion. So there's a lot of gray areas in the cultural and practice of some of this. But again, legally, not a problem. Not a problem. So again, a lot of it was an economic decision, right? And it was initially, or later on, much later in the empire, it is exposure, infanticide it becomes illegal, not abortion though. At some point we can talk about Christian beliefs on abortion and how they evolve, but initially it is not. I mean, it's not illegal in Rome. So I don't have time to cover everything about Rome. Like I haven't even touched on the gladiators and the games and the Roman baths or any of that. But I can talk about some of it next week. Anything in particular you are particularly interested about Rome? You guys were very interested in the indoor plumbing last time I mentioned it. So maybe I should talk about the indoor plumbing and the Romans, because that actually does happen during the Roman Empire. Okay, everybody always is interested in the games. I can. Okay. And the heated floors. You want heated floors and everything. I, I I just realized I was like, oh shoot, I ended that PowerPoint on infanticide. I shouldn't end on something so depressing. It's really interesting. And in some ways, like some ideas we have about Rome are true. And then other things, totally not true. Right? We borrow some things from Rome, things we like from Rome, we end up borrowing, right? Some of the legal structure from the Roman Republic, some philosophy, definitely a lot of law we borrow from Rome, but not everything, right? Because I'm like, and it can mess with our ideas of what's right and wrong because they lived in a very different world than ours. Right? So okay, we want the heated floors for sure, the baths and the games. Okay, I will make sure to talk about those next week.
Oh, and the Colosseum too.
And the Colosseum. Oh, and by the way, I've never been to Italy, so to Rome. But if any of you have actual images, if you've been, bring them to class because I'm always super jealous. Actually, I do have one image to show you. I once accidentally ran into a smaller, what is it called? Roman arena in Paris. The Romans are in France and go all the way up to England. So actually, I've seen two. I've seen one in Paris and I've seen a Roman arena in England too. And I do have pictures of those. So those are the pictures that I will bring with me. But if anybody has pictures of their travels in Rome and or the rest of Italy, I'm always happy to see them. Okay, so you do have a discussion this week due on Sunday. Mostly some of these are like the first one about the controversies come directly from the readings, right? Question 1 and 2 is from the readings, and then the rest are from lecture, except the last one where it's just what do you like, right? This one in describing the transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire, and I ask you what the key factors are. That's up to you, right? There are several things, and historians don't all agree on what the exact moment or the key that makes Rome go from a republic to an empire. So you can just bring up what are the main things that stood out to you in terms of why the republic ends and then it becomes an empire. So go to Europe. That is one of my missions, is to get you all to want to travel abroad. And I'm like, there are some places in Europe that are cliche. Some of them are a bit disappointing, but I have found, like for me, just because of my love, my francophone nature, the Eiffel Tower was not a disappointment. London was though. Wait, I should not be recording this so people can't come for me.